You think the failure is public, but what disturbs you is not the audience, it is your agreement with their verdict, and that agreement is still unsettled. The exposure is an event. Being seen, judged, or misunderstood happens outside your authority. Yet the disturbance does not come from the eyes watching you. It comes from the judgment you attach to what those eyes mean. You do not suffer because you failed in public. You suffer because you decided that this failure defines you, diminishes you, or removes something that was never theirs to give. The mistake begins when appearance becomes truth. An impression arrives, they saw me fail. Then interpretation follows, I am now reduced. And without examination, assent seals it. From there, the reaction feels inevitable, but it was not. It was permitted. If you do not separate what is shown from what is concluded, you will keep surrendering what is yours to what was never under your control. Examine the judgment before you agree to it. The first confusion is ownership. It appears simple, but it is where most collapse begins. What happened in public is not yours. The reaction of others is not yours. Their judgment, whether harsh or indifferent, does not belong to your authority. Reputation lives outside you. It moves through other minds. It shifts without your consent. To claim it as yours is to take responsibility for what you cannot govern. What is yours is narrower. It is your judgment about the event. Your assent to the impression. Your response after the moment has passed. That is the boundary. When this boundary is ignored, effort is misdirected. You begin trying to repair what cannot be controlled. You replay the scene, not to correct your own reasoning, but to manage how others saw you. You attempt to adjust their thoughts, their memory, their interpretation. This is labor without authority. The disturbance grows from this confusion. Not because failure was visible, but because you assigned ownership to visibility itself. You treated exposure as if it belonged to you to manage, instead of recognizing it as an external condition. Consider the difference. If the event is external, then it cannot damage what is properly yours. It can affect circumstance. It can influence outcomes. But it cannot reach your ruling faculty unless you permit it through judgment. The pain intensifies when the mind says, "This should not have happened in front of others." That statement reveals the misplacement. It assumes that the visibility of the event alters its nature. It does not. The event remains the same. Only the interpretation changes. Once the mind claims ownership over how it was seen, it becomes dependent. Every imagined observer becomes a source of disturbance. Every memory of the moment becomes a renewed injury. Not because the event repeats, but because the judgment is repeated. This is why public failure feels heavier than private failure. Not because the failure is greater, but because more external elements are falsely claimed. The mind expands its field of ownership beyond what is actually within its control. To correct this, the boundary must be restored with precision. You do not control who saw. You do not control what they think now. You do not control how long they remember. You do not control how your image shifts in their minds. You control whether you agree that any of this defines you. That is the only point where authority exists. And it is often abandoned first. If you refuse to claim what is not yours, the structure of disturbance changes. The event remains. The visibility remains. But the internal collapse does not follow automatically. Because the chain has been broken at its first false link. Still, this boundary alone does not explain why the disturbance feels immediate and convincing. Knowing what is yours does not prevent the reaction from forming. Something else is operating underneath. That movement must be examined next. The disturbance does not begin where you think it does. It begins before the story forms. Before you say they judged me. Before you conclude this damaged me. It begins at the level of impression. An impression arrives immediately. It is fast. Uninvited. They saw it. This looks bad. I am exposed. This stage is not yet error. It is appearance. It carries no authority by itself. Then interpretation attaches. Quietly. This is humiliating. This lowers my standing. This should not have happened. Now the impression is no longer neutral. It is being shaped. Meaning is being added. But even here, the process is not complete. There is still a gap. A narrow one. Often ignored. Assent. Assent is the moment the mind says yes. Not verbally. Not loudly. But decisively. It agrees that the interpretation is true. It accepts the appearance as a valid judgment. Once assent is given, the structure locks. Impression, interpretation, assent, reaction. The reaction then feels justified, inevitable, even necessary. Shame rises. Tension follows. Avoidance begins. Not because the event demanded it, but because the mind endorsed the interpretation without examination. This is where most confusion persists. The reaction feels automatic, so it is treated as unavoidable. But what is automatic is the arrival of impression. What is not automatic is the endorsement. You can feel the surge and still refuse the conclusion. This refusal is rarely practiced. The mind is trained to move quickly. It treats speed as accuracy. It assumes that what appears first must be correct. Especially under public exposure, where urgency increases and scrutiny feels immediate. So the sequence collapses. Impression and assent merge. No space remains. That was bad becomes this is bad becomes I am diminished. All in one motion. But this compression is learned. It is not necessary. If the impression is held for a moment, just long enough to separate it from judgment, the structure changes. The appearance remains. The audience remains. But the interpretation is no longer binding. You begin to see the parts. The event is visible. That is true. Others may form opinions. That is possible. But that this reduces your value is not contained in the event itself. That part was added. And what is added can be examined. Once examined, it can be refused. Refusal does not mean denial of the event. It means refusal to grant authority to an interpretation that has not been tested. It is a correction at the point of agreement. Without this, every public failure becomes a compounded error. First the event. Then the unexamined interpretation. Then the full endorsement. Then the reaction that reinforces it. This is how a moment becomes a pattern. Because the same sequence repeats. Faster each time. More convincing each time. Until it no longer feels like interpretation at all, but like fact. And at that point, the mind no longer sees its own participation. It believes it is only reacting. Understanding this mechanism does not dissolve it. Recognition is not training. Seeing the structure does not mean you can interrupt it under pressure. The interruption must be practiced. The pause must be trained. The refusal must become available before the moment demands it. Otherwise, the mind will return to speed. And speed will return to error. Understanding the mechanism is not discipline. It is only exposure. You can see the sequence, impression, interpretation, assent, and still submit to it every time. Knowledge does not interrupt habit. It only makes the habit visible. Discipline begins where recognition is followed by refusal. But this refusal is often misunderstood. It is not force. It is not suppression. It is not the attempt to silence the reaction or overpower it. That approach confuses the target. The problem is not the reaction itself. The problem is the agreement beneath it. If you try to fight the feeling, you are already too late. The assent has already been given. The interpretation has already been accepted. What remains is only the consequence. So discipline must move earlier. It must operate at the point where interpretation seeks approval. This is where training becomes necessary. Not once. Repeatedly. Before the moment arrives. Because in the moment of public exposure, speed returns. The mind does not slow down simply because you understand it should. It defaults to its practiced pattern. If the pattern is immediate agreement, then agreement will happen again. So the training must install a different pattern. A delay. A pause that is not passive, but active. An interruption that does not remove the impression, but refuses to finalize it. This is the work. When the impression appears, this is humiliating. The trained response is not denial. It is examination. What is being claimed here? Is this event equal to the conclusion I am attaching to it? Where is the evidence that this alters what is mine to govern? These are not comforting questions. They are corrective ones. They introduce friction where speed previously ruled. At first, this friction feels unnatural. The mind resists it. It prefers the familiarity of immediate agreement. It prefers the certainty of quick judgment, even if that certainty produces disturbance. But repetition changes this. Each time the impression is examined instead of endorsed, the automatic chain weakens. The distance between appearance and assent increases. And in that distance, authority returns. This is why discipline cannot be improvised. If you wait until the moment of exposure to begin correcting, you are attempting to reverse a practiced habit under pressure. That rarely holds. The correction must exist before the test. In small moments. Quiet ones. Unnoticed ones. When something minor goes wrong and the mind says, "This is a problem," the same structure is present. The same opportunity exists. If you allow the mind to agree without examination in these smaller cases, you are reinforcing the very mechanism that will dominate under public pressure. But if you interrupt it there, where the stakes feel low, you are building the capacity to interrupt it when the stakes feel high. Discipline is not built in crisis. It is revealed there. What you do repeatedly when it does not matter will decide what happens when it does. And this removes another illusion. That discipline makes you unshaken. It does not. Impressions will still arrive. Faster in public. Stronger in visibility. The body may still react. The initial movement may still occur. But the difference is not in what arrives. It is in what is allowed to stay. Without discipline, the impression becomes identity. With discipline, the impression remains an appearance. That distinction is everything. Because once the impression is no longer mistaken for truth, the rest of the chain cannot form in the same way. The reaction loses its authority. The event loses its expansion. The moment remains contained. And what remains available is choice. Not perfect control. Not immunity. But the ability to decide whether the interpretation will be accepted. That is the training. And if it is not practiced deliberately, it will not appear when it is required. Discipline must become visible in action, or it remains an idea. It is not enough to understand where assent happens. It must be interrupted in real time. That requires specific operations. Repeatable ones. When the moment occurs, when the failure is seen, when the reaction begins, the first task is not to correct the event. It is to slow the agreement. When the impression arrives, name it. Not as truth, but as appearance. This is an impression. Not, this is humiliating. Not, this is damaging. Only, this appears this way. This naming creates distance. It prevents immediate fusion between what is seen and what is concluded. Then the next movement. Separate the event from the added judgment. The event is, a mistake occurred in public. The judgment is, this reduces my value. Hold both. Do not merge them. This separation is not theoretical. It is operational. Without it, the mind compresses both into one statement and proceeds without resistance. Then the examination. Ask, does the event contain the conclusion? Not what it suggests. Not what others may think. But what is actually present? The event contains visibility. It may contain error. It does not contain your worth. That conclusion was introduced. It was not found. If this is seen clearly, assent can be withheld. Not permanently. Not perfectly. But in that moment. Refusal is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the absence of agreement. I do not accept this conclusion. The impression remains. The body may still react. But the structure has changed. The chain is broken before completion. Then comes response. Without assent, response becomes available again. Not reaction, but choice. You may still act. You may still correct the mistake. You may still address what happened. But you are no longer acting from a position of internal collapse. You are acting from retained authority. This must be repeated. Not only in moments of exposure, but in ordinary conditions. When something minor irritates you. When a delay occurs. When a small error appears. The same structure is present. The same sequence operates. If you wait for public failure to practice, you will fail again at the same point. So the practice must be daily. When X happens, pause before conclusion. When X happens, separate event from judgment. When X happens, examine the added meaning. When X happens, refuse untested assent. This is not a checklist. It is a pattern of correction. Over time, the delay becomes shorter. The examination becomes faster. The refusal becomes more immediate. Not because the world changes, but because your participation in it changes. There is also a second operation. Review. After the moment has passed, return to it. Not to relive it. Not to judge yourself. But to examine where assent occurred. Where did the impression become conclusion? Where was the pause absent? Where did agreement happen without scrutiny? This is not for self-condemnation. That would be another unexamined judgment. It is for precision. Because without review, error remains vague. And what is vague cannot be corrected. Through review, the pattern becomes visible. Through visibility, it becomes interruptible. And through repeated interruption, it weakens. This is how practice becomes structure. Not by eliminating difficulty, but by reducing how much of it is created internally. At this point, something shifts. Public exposure still occurs. Mistakes still happen. Visibility remains. But the internal response is no longer automatic. The moment is no longer total. And this opens the question that was hidden at the beginning. If the event does not define you, and the judgment is no longer automatically accepted, what, then, is freedom in this condition? Freedom is not the absence of exposure. It is the absence of submission. The event still occurs. The audience still exists. The possibility of failure remains. None of this is removed. Stoic freedom does not rearrange external conditions. It alters the relation to them. Before correction, the mind is easily captured. An impression appears, and authority is transferred outward. What is seen becomes what is true. What others may think becomes what is accepted. The ruling faculty yields without resistance. This is not freedom. It is quiet dependency. Because the self is now governed by what is not its own. By perception. By imagined judgment. By external reception. Each of these moves outside your authority, yet each is treated as if it holds command. So the condition becomes unstable. Every public moment carries risk. Not because of the event itself, but because of the readiness to agree with whatever interpretation arises from it. Freedom begins when this readiness is reduced. Not eliminated. Reduced. When the mind no longer grants immediate authority to appearance, something changes. The impression still arrives. It may still carry force. But it does not automatically become law. there is a delay. In that delay, sovereignty appears. You are no longer required to accept the first interpretation. You are no longer bound to convert visibility into value. You are no longer compelled to turn exposure into identity. This does not make the experience pleasant. It makes it governed. And this is the distinction. Freedom is not comfort. It is control over assent. When this control stabilizes, public failure loses its expansion. It does not multiply into self-judgment, future anxiety, or repeated mental replay. It remains what it is: a limited event. Without this, the event continues long after it ends. It is revisited, reinterpreted, reinforced. Not because it persists, but because the judgment persists. So long as assent continues, the event is kept alive. Freedom interrupts this continuation. It allows the event to end where it actually ends. This does not produce invulnerability. There is no final state where disturbance cannot occur. The mind remains active. Impressions continue. Errors in judgment still happen. Freedom is not a permanent condition. It is a maintained one. It requires continued correction. Each time the mind agrees too quickly, the same structure returns. The same dependency reappears. The same expansion begins again. So freedom is not secured once. It is practiced continuously. And this gives it its weight. Because it demands attention. Not occasionally. Repeatedly. But the return is precise. Less time lost to what is not yours. Less energy given to imagined observers. Less identity attached to passing events. More stability in the ruling faculty. Not because the world has become stable, but because you have reduced your submission to its instability. At this point, public exposure changes character. It is no longer a threat to identity. It is an external condition that may require response, correction, or adjustment, but not internal surrender. You may still act to improve. You may still learn from the failure. You may still refine your skill or judgment in practical terms. But these actions are no longer driven by the need to repair a damaged self-image. They are guided by reason, not by reaction. This is a quieter form of strength. Not visible. Not dramatic. But consistent. Because it does not depend on outcome. It does not depend on approval. It does not depend on how the moment is received. It depends only on whether you maintain authority over assent. And this is why freedom does not remove difficulty. It removes the unnecessary addition to difficulty. The event remains. The error remains. The exposure remains. But the internal collapse does not follow as a rule. That is the difference. And it is enough. The failure was never the full problem. The exposure was never the final cause. What gave both their force was the judgment added afterward, and the assent that confirmed it without examination. The mistake is not that you reacted. The mistake is that you treated the reaction as proof. You allowed appearance to become authority. You allowed visibility to become value. And in doing so, you handed over what was yours to govern. The task is narrower than it first appears. Not to erase the event. Not to control how it is seen. Not to prevent future exposure. But to correct the place where interpretation becomes agreement. This is where responsibility lies. Each time you separate the event from the meaning added to it, you reduce confusion. Each time you delay assent, you weaken the chain that turns a moment into identity. Each time you refuse an untested conclusion, you restore order to the ruling faculty. You will not do this perfectly. The mind will still agree too quickly. Impressions will still carry force. But correction does not require perfection. It requires recognition and return. So when the next exposure comes, do not attempt to manage the audience. Do not attempt to repair the image. Turn instead to the judgment forming within you, and examine it before you accept it. Return to what is yours to govern.